We are live again, and welcome back to Sports Crunch with D. Crom. I am your host, David Cromwell, and NFL training camps. It's that time of year again, folks. NFL training camps begin in a matter of days, and that means that now is the time to hit the books and intensely study for your fantasy football drafts. And to help you do that, we continue our fantasy football series of this podcast tonight with an analysis on wide receivers. And with a lot of uncertainty at the running back position this season, 2016 could very well be the year of the wide receiver in fantasy. And we have the perfect guest to break down wide receivers tonight. He is an expert when it comes to wide receiver talent. Currently a staff writer for NFL.com's top-notch fantasy staff, Matt Harmon is known for his unique method of evaluating wide receivers known as reception perception. And that method successfully predicted a breakout season for Jaguars wide receiver Allen Robinson last year. And Matt also still contributes to footballguys.com, and we had Gene Bramble and Cecil Lammy on their program earlier, two of their regular contributors, so that great fantasy site as well. Can't promote that enough. And also he hosts his own podcast, the Backyard Banter Podcast, that he doesn't need any further introduction. It's a pleasure to welcome Matt Harmon to the show. How you doing, Matt?
I'm doing great, man. It's good to be here. You know, I don't know about the term expert on the wide receiver position, but I certainly spend an awful lot of time watching the position. So hopefully during all that time, I'm managing to find some useful information to dispense to your listeners tonight. But thank you so much for having me on. You know, it's that, like you said, it is that time of year. It feels like it has just come out of nowhere, but here we are.
Absolutely. And forgive me for using the word expert. Expert is an insulting term I've heard numerous times. The correct word would be analyst. And as an aspiring writer, I have to use my words correctly. So I would call you a top-notch analyst in that regard, because analyzing football isn't rocket science, is it?
No, that is correct. I always say it's, if I can reading ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics off the pyramids, it's just watching a sport. So I don't like the idea of anybody thinking that, oh, you can never be as good as me at doing this. Like, hey, listen, just sit down and practice it enough, study up on it, and like you said, it'll come to you.
It most certainly will if you put in the work. And let's start with some big news that broke this morning and its potential impact on a big wide receiver. Steelers running back Le'Veon Bell is facing a probable 4-game suspension for missing a league-mandated drug test, as ESPN's Dan Graziano first reported. And since the Steelers will be without Bell for at least 25% of the season, given his health reasons, that's why I used the words "at least" in that sentence, and Martavis Bryant for the entire season, does that make you want to move Antonio Brown down from the top wide receiver spot and replace it with, say, Odell Beckham Jr. or Julio Jones?
You know, I had a few people actually asking me that this morning, or even suggesting, like, man, Bell makes me nervous now. And I don't necessarily think that way. I was actually kind of surprised that was a line of thinking, but I guess I understand where people got that from, especially because I said this kind of makes me completely out on Ben Roethlisberger at his current ADP, but I'm still in on Brown as the number one overall pick in fantasy format. And that's mostly because, I think Antonio Brown's the type of talent and the type of technician that could someday have like a 2,000-yard receiving season. And we really could be looking at that season this year with just the massive amount of targets he's going to have to fill. You know, with Bryant being gone, you mentioned that. Now with Bell, who's a prime receiver, being gone for at least 4 weeks, as you mentioned, Brown could really see, over 200 targets this year. He pushed that last year. I mean, really, I think we're really looking at a special season from Brown regardless, but now almost out of necessity, it has to be one.
Oh, I completely agree. Given Antonio Brown's superhuman technique, dare I say, he still cannot be ignored at that number one overall spot in drafts, period, in my opinion. And now moving on to reception perception. How did reception perception come about, and explain how it works?
Yeah, so how it came about was kind of a mixture of several different things. One being, as a total nobody in my early days. I mean, I don't know whether I'm still whether I'm a somebody or whatever, but when I first started out, I obviously knew that I needed a unique piece of content to stand out because it's a very crowded space. There's a lot of great people out there doing just fantastic work. And as welcoming as the fantasy community is for new people, it's also very competitive to get in and stand out. So I wanted something, unique to have, to bring to the table, something that nobody else was doing. Really, I thought there was just a market to study wide receivers, because when I was coming in, that was the year of the historic 2014 draft class of wide receivers. There's just a dearth of, or not a dearth, just a ridiculous amount of talent at the wide receiver position across the NFL. It's such a deep group right now. So I thought it was a good time to get in on that position. And it's just a fun position to study. And really what I wanted to accomplish was kind of quantify route running. How often does a guy run a slant route? How often does a guy run a post route? And then do they get open? What routes are they best at getting open on? What type of coverages are they most successful against? So I really just sit there and over an 8-game sample for NFL players, 6-game for college players, chart every route that they run. And so, just keeping a really strict rubric log of what they do, and then put those into presentable data points. Success rate versus coverage is really the main one that people are interested in. How often are you getting open against each particular route? So that's really what it tries to accomplish, just helping to put players, what they do well, stack them against other players in the league and see where they fit best. It's not necessarily something like to say, this guy sucks or this guy's great, but it's really understanding who they are as a player and what, and being like Allen Robinson's a great example of what I think the series is most useful for, is finding players that are consistently getting open and running great routes, but just haven't got the targets yet, so that that when the opportunity comes, that's a player that's going to step up big time.
Absolutely. And I just read some of your pieces using that method, and I completely agree and admire how you emphasize route running, because in my opinion, if you cannot run routes or a comprehensive route tree at the NFL level, you're not going to survive that for that long. Don't you agree?
Right. Well, I think that's the one thing and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do it, is it's something that we don't see on a broadcast game on Sunday. All we know is where the ball is going. A receiver is running a route on almost every pass play, and every one of those routes, more often than not, is an opportunity to get open, and that's how you get targets. Well, unless there is one, it's completely designed for you on the play. That's the opportunity for you at first point, is to get open on the route, and that's how you get targets, and how you get targets is how you produce yards and touchdowns and fantasy points, etc. So it's really the first step, and so you're kind of getting on the ground level of the player.
I completely agree. He's Matt Harmon, ladies and gentlemen, fantasy staff writer at NFL.com and footballguys.com, and host of the Backyard Banter podcast. And moving on to this draft strategy that has been thrown around the fantasy community in recent years. Are you familiar with the so-called zero running back strategy? And especially in a year like this, who, if anybody, would you recommend put that strategy to use during their actual drafts?
Oh yeah, certainly very familiar with it. There were a lot of different variations of kind of zigging when people are zagging. Matt Waldman, who I'm sure you're familiar with, popularized do the opposite. Paul Charchian was the one that did do the opposite. Matt Waldman was upside down drafting, but Sean Siegel from RotoViz really put a comprehensive system and guide to it, and really talked about just punting the running back position because it's so fragile. And I think we saw like the apocalyptic version of that last year, where seemingly every fantasy relevant running back took a hit at one point or another, whether it was production, losing playing time, or just straight up injuries. And I think that's the biggest thing with the running back position, is it's an injury riddled position. So it's a good strategy to avoid those riskier players. Wide receivers are just much safer from a week-to-week perspective. They also, especially with the popularization of PPR scoring formats, they score more points. Like if you have a flex, you want that flex spot to be a wide receiver, especially if you have multiple flex spots, because they have just a much higher ceiling as an individual player than running backs do. More consistently, they're going to hit that ceiling. So I think it's a really great strategy. The thing about it is now, like, it's of course less of a contrarian strategy. More people are on it. We're sitting here talking about it right now on a podcast. It just goes to show you, like, it's more popular. More people are aware of it. So there will be more zero RB drafters this year than ever have been before. But I think it is still a really great strategy. I was sitting today especially after the Le'Veon Bell news, and I was really thinking about it. And really right now, like, of course, we didn't bring it up, but Ezekiel Elliott also got into the news today for a potentially not so great reason. We'll see how that plays out. So if Zeke is compromised along with Le'Veon Bell, really the only running back that I feel comfortable with from an upside projection, from a floor projection, and just an overall just comfortability perspective in the first round is David Johnson. And that's honestly, that's it. I can tell myself plenty of stories about what goes wrong with Todd Gurley this year, or Lamar Miller. Those are probably my next ranked guys. Adrian Peterson's another great floor play, but he's also getting up there. Like there are guys that are riskier that I would rather take in the second round, in the first round. And then just beyond that, like that middle, the top tier of the wide receiver group right now is so strong. The three elite guys, AJ Green, I love this year, Hopkins, Allen Robinson, Keenan Allen, Mike Evans, all those guys. You want to pluck from a couple of guys from that tier, but that middle class is very deep and strong too. And just if you can load up on wide receivers, it's a really good way to just create a powerhouse team. And that's really what you should be looking for.
I completely agree. That is going to be pretty much my strategy in the early rounds this year. And and you mentioned a lot of names there. And speaking, let's go to one name that I was high on before I read this article of yours. And you recently wrote a reception perception evaluation on Seahawks wide receiver Tyler Lockett. And I was wondering, which round at the earliest would you consider drafting him? And what is a reasonable stat line to expect from him this season in terms of reception yards and touchdowns?
Yeah, I think he's an interesting player. He's a guy that obviously I just recently wrote up, and there's a lot of buzz around him, not just from me, but also Sheil Kapadia from ESPN wrote a really good piece on him that I think got a lot of people buzzing as well. I think the earliest I would take him, and I've done so in several MFL 10s, which are a more conducive strategy to a player like Lockett because it's a best ball league where you're not necessarily having to set a lineup every week, but the computer is taking your highest scores for you, is the 5th round. Would really be the earliest I would think about it. Anything more than that, you're probably kind of pushing it. The 5th round might even be his ceiling as what he'll do this year, but I think he's just a really special talent, a really special route runner, a guy that can separate at all levels of the field. And one thing I heard consistently from sources reaching out to people close to the team was that they think he has an elite ceiling. They think he could lead the team in receiving yards this year, even though they just paid Doug Baldwin. I think everybody around the team knows that Lockett will be the better player in the long term, and that could start this year. And also, I would expect his yards per reception to jump up this year a little bit because last year there were several big plays where Lockett was streaking up and down the field, and Wilson missed him by just a hair. And you're always going to miss a little bit on those deep throws and every now and again. But if they start connecting a little more with more chemistry, I mean, he could really have an explosive season. So I'm thinking, somewhere in the neighborhood between 1,000 to 1,200 yards, and maybe I don't think he'll ever be an elite touchdown scorer this early in his career. So maybe you're looking at about 6 to 8 touchdowns at most. But that would well pay off a 5 to 7 round asking price, in my opinion, especially if he's your wide receiver 3 or 4, if you're going with a heavy wide receiver strategy.
Thank you very much for that analysis on Lockett. And as I said, I'm excited about him as you. And let's move on to another list of receivers. And we call this segment of our program Buy and Sell. And that's a game countless fantasy owners are going to be having to play with themselves over this next month or so. And let's start our buy and sell game with Sterling Shepard. Do you buy or do you sell the hype surrounding Sterling Shepard?
Oh, yeah, big time buy. I loved Sterling Shepard coming out of Oklahoma. He was a reception perception favorite. He had an 82.8 success rate versus man coverage, 91.1 success rate versus press coverage. Both of those scores were the highest among charted rookies. And, he runs a lot of routes from the slot. He runs a bit from flanker as well, too. And that's what he'll do in New York. It's really a perfect fit for his skill set because he runs a lot of those short, intermediate, timing, nuanced routes, and he really was the best route runner from this class. I think he'll have the best rookie season from a fantasy perspective of these guys, even though he was drafted in the 2nd round. I'm a real big fan of Sterling Shepard, and he just so happened to end up going to a pretty perfect landing spot where he's essentially already penciled into the number 2 receiver role.
I completely agree. I'm very high on him. And another rookie that's getting a lot of buzz is Michael Thomas of the New Orleans Saints. Buy or sell?
I'm going to I don't want to say sell sounds harsh, but I'm going to kind of sell a big year 1 season for him for a few reasons. I think the Saints offense is going to be great. I think it's kind of getting back to a few years ago when it was one of the best offenses in the league. And that's great. But the problem with that is I think it's going to be really spread out. I don't think any one of these guys is going to be – I like Brandon Cooks as a player more than I did about a year ago, but I still don't think he's like a 30% market share target hog type of player. I think he'll handle about 130 targets, and everybody else will split between 100 and 120. And that might be being a little bit conservative considering Drew Brees is pretty much annually a 650 pass attempt guy. But I think because it will be spread out like that, it'll be tough to predict week to week. I think Thomas will certainly have weeks, especially in shootouts where he's a viable DFS play or maybe like a bye-week filler receiver. But I really like Willie Snead. I'm a big Snead fan. He's somebody that I wrote up pretty recently. I think he holds on to that number 2 job. And I also think they paid big money to Coby Fleener to play in that split out tight end role. And I think he and Thomas will cannibalize each other a little bit because they have similar sort of skill sets, even though they play different positions. And they're both going to run a lot of routes from the slot and attack the seams. So I think you'll see those two cannibalize each other a lot. So I'll say sell on Thomas for this year, but I also think he will have very viable weeks.
Very good point, given the mouths to feed of that Saints offense, like you mentioned. And it looks like the Minnesota Vikings have somebody to play the Michael Irvin role at last in the Norv Turner offense and Laquan Treadwell. Do you buy or sell Laquan Treadwell?
I kind of I'll say like we'll see, because I just don't know if they're ready to turn the offense over to Teddy Bridgewater or it will still be an Adrian Peterson focused unit. Odds are that it'll be an AP focused unit until he decides to retire or the team and he part ways. So for now, I will say, for fantasy, we'll see, because I do think he is just a tremendous player. I think that he's a guy that, like they're even saying they're going to up the route assignment specifically to fit him. And I think that makes a lot of sense because he is just a hell of a route runner. He's a guy that, his athletic testing numbers before the combine weren't great, but I also think that he knows how to play with strength, physicality, technique, and short area quickness. And that's really what it takes to be a good route runner, not so much the athletic ability, even though you do need to hit certain baselines there. So I really like Treadwell. I love the fit in that offense long term, but I'm thinking year one impact, it depends on where he goes, honestly. If he starts to slip into the 10th to 12th round, I'm in on him, but anywhere before selling.
Yes, yes, I agree a lot of what you said on Treadwell, but he's going to do great things in the very near term. And this guy is receiving hype as a volume monster. Cory Coleman, buy or sell?
Yeah, I'm going to buy on Coleman with the caveat that now that we're hearing, unfortunately, I don't want to even talk about Josh Gordon until he's actually been reinstated. But I'll bring up his name and just say with the caveat that if Josh Gordon is reinstated, it changes the picture for Cory Coleman. But talking about the Browns right now without the specter of Gordon, I love the projection this year. I think that he will own a pretty big share of the targets there. I think he and Gary Barnidge will compete for the top spot. They obviously want to run a pretty conservative offense. They want to go through the running game, but I don't necessarily know that they have the personnel to do that right now. And even though the quarterback play is questionable behind center, I think Cory Coleman is the type of guy who is a playmaker. So Ben Natan, who writes for Bleeding Green, the SB Nation Eagles blog, he made the comparison of Cory Coleman being used in a Martavis Bryant role early in his career. And I think that's a great comparison. Not that the two are comparable physically, but the way that Hugh Jackson can get Coleman the ball in very similar ways, bubble screens, just quick hitting slants to use him after the catch, and also on vertical patterns. I think we could see that sort of role for Coleman very quickly. And the fact that he could push 120 targets as a rookie is really appealing. He'll be volatile week to week, of course, but I really like him this year.
He definitely will be volatile given the unstable quarterback position as it remains in Cleveland. And how about Josh Doctson, buy or sell?
I'm going to say buy because of the price right now. He falls really late. Like 13th round, I think he went in our most recent NFL fantasy staff mock. I got him really late in the Scott Fish Bowl that just went on pretty recently. And honestly, at that price, I will take Doctson all day. He is behind Jackson, Reed, potentially Pierre Garçon in the pecking order. And Jamison Crowder is a good player too. However, there are plenty of avenues in which Doxson can leap that pecking order very quickly. Jackson and Reed and especially Reed, are not the pictures of health. If Reed was to get hurt, I think Doxson would immediately become the team's top red zone threat because of his ability of playing the ball in the air, and he just has superior size to the rest of those guys. Garçon, I think, is nearing the tail end of his career as a starting receiver in the NFL, and I think that Doxson could easily just outright leap him in general. So there's a lot of ways that Doxson could end up paying off a far better value than where he's being drafted right now. I get that he's behind a lot of guys at the moment, but things could change very quickly. And also, I just expect this Washington offense to be pretty pass heavy and be pretty good at scoring. I think that Kirk Cousins is good enough to make do of this really diverse and talented array of weapons.
Oh, yes. And another area in which I see Doxson climbing up the pecking order is in terms of red zone targets. Like if you expect Washington to score a lot on offense, that means they're probably going to be in the red zone quite often. And Garçon and Deshaun Jackson are petite receivers, and the red zone is where size is arguably as important as route running. And the only guy with size in the red zone, not named Jordan Reed on that team right now, is Doxson. So do you see his red zone targets potentially eclipsing those of Pierre and Djax?
Oh, certainly. I think that's probably why they drafted him, because other than Reed, they don't have a receiver who can play the ball in the air in contested situations. Like you mentioned, Garçon has good ball skills. Jackson's a burner, but that's, who he is. So I think you're dead on there with that.
Absolutely, and he's a name to definitely pay attention to. And how about talk about second-year wide receivers, and we start off with Kevin White, buy or sell?
Oh, man, it's tough with Kevin White right now. For where he's going, I think he's fine. I would buy in the 7th to 9th. I feel like it's kind of pushing it. If he falls in the 8th to 9th round, I'll buy on that price. But if he goes higher than that, and he certainly does in certain formats, like in MFL 10s, he usually goes earlier with a lot of sharp drafters that are just paying attention to the guys. I think there is a chance that he could be a league-winning type of pick, but there's also some downside. Of course, we've never seen him play a pro snap, which that doesn't really matter that much to me. I'm perfectly willing to take that risk. But at the same time, is this going to be a really pass-heavy offense? Is Alshon Jeffery going to be the type of player that just dominates the target share? He certainly was last year when Kevin White was not available. And I also like Zach Miller to have a pretty good share there too. So it just depends completely on price. If he's going to slip to that 8th to 9th round range, I'll buy all day. Any earlier than that, I'm getting a little nervous.
Completely agree. And especially with Alshon playing under the franchise tag, he's going to be motivated to light up that stat sheet. So White's target could be limited. And how about Devontae Parker, buy or sell?
Yeah, I'm going to sell on Parker. He's somebody that I just wrote about in my overvalued wide receivers piece. Not even just getting into the fact, can Ryan Tannehill really support 2 top 24 fantasy receivers? I don't know based on what we've seen out of Tannehill so far, but Parker really struggled against press coverage last year. And obviously he was coming back from a foot injury, but it's another thing that we noticed from his game film in college, that he really only had one release move off the line of scrimmage. And you're able to get away with that when you're better than everybody athletically in college. You're able to get away with that against inferior cornerbacks. But when you get to the NFL and people are just bigger, stronger, and better, you get sapped there. And I think that that's a problem that he faced as a rookie. It's a problem that he could continue to face if he's not put in the right position. I also think that the Dolphins are aware of that limitation. That's why they drafted a guy like Leonte Carroo, who can play that X receiver position and line up on the line of scrimmage and get off against press coverage, while they're able to move Parker into the slot and play flanker, alternating with Jarvis Landry. But for fantasy, I just don't know that where he's being drafted right now. I think he's being drafted at his ceiling. I think that the 7th round, where he goes to more casual leagues, to the 5th or 4th round in MFL 10s is pretty completely out of control. I wouldn't pay that price for the pretty clear downside of a player like Devontae Parker, even though I think, in 2 to 3 years from now, he could be a very good starting receiver.
Yes, and you mentioned Leonte Carroo, and we continue buy and sell with Leonte Carroo. Do you buy or sell him?
I mean, I really buy him as a player. I really buy him as a player in that offense that I think is important. Like I said, I think they had a clear role for him when they picked him in the draft. They called him a target player coming out of the draft that year. He's a guy they traded a third and fourth next year to go up and get this season. So I buy him as a player there. I think he's going to be really good and helpful for that offense. But for fantasy, unless there's an injury, I'm probably selling because he'll, at absolute best, be the number 3 target there. And if I'm already concerned that Tannehill can support 2 targets, I certainly don't think he can support 3 relevant targets.
Yes. And we conclude our buy and sell segment of the program with a guy who might get an opportunity given injuries and free agency departures, Tyler Boyd in Cincinnati. You buy or sell?
Yeah, I sell Boyd as well. He's another one that struggled in reception perception coming out of Pittsburgh. He had the second worst success rate versus man coverage, second worst versus press coverage. And he's just a guy that's very limited. And I think he's already playing in a very limited role. They much have said he'll be their slot receiver no matter what. Brandon LaFell is going to start at the number 2 role until he proves, which he certainly could, prove incapable of it. And I really think that AJ Green is going to have one of those seasons where he pushes for 170 targets and really dominates the market share of that offense. And I just don't know that there's any sort of realistic ceiling for Boyd this year. I think they're going to throw a lot to Green. They're going to throw a lot to Gio Bernard out of the backfield. And when Tyler Eifert's there, we know he's going to command targets. And if you're putting Brandon LaFell ahead of Boyd in the pecking order too, that's really getting down to like the 5th or 6th spot. And that's not something that on an Andy Dalton-led offense that I'm really interested in investing in.
He's Matt Harmon, ladies and gentlemen, NFL.com fantasy football staff writer and footballguys.com fantasy staff writer, and also host of the Backyard Banter Podcast and creator of the reception perception method of evaluating wide receivers. And a question that perplexes me and probably a lot of other fantasy owners when it comes to drafting wide receivers every year is, geez, who's throwing the ball to them? And that's obviously natural, but we saw last year with DeAndre Hopkins in particular that receivers that have a tendency to get open and catch the ball exceptionally well can mask below average quarterback play. And I kind of see a few receivers in similar positions to do those. So this year, maybe not with the stat line Nuke Hopkins had last year, but in an efficient way that could make them solid week fantasy plays almost on a weekly basis, like let's say Emmanuel Sanders in Denver, who is very exceptional at route running and catching whatever kind of balls are thrown at him. Don't you see him and any other receivers having that kind of year in which they mask quarterback deficiencies?
Oh, certainly. I think actually that quarterback play when picking fantasy receivers is something that gets way too overemphasized. I mean, just look at last year. Like, obviously Ryan Fitzpatrick had a very good season for his standards, but like this time last year, people were panicking about the Jets wide receivers. You know, Brandon Marshall, I'm not drafting him with Ryan Fitzpatrick or Geno Smith throwing the ball. Eric Decker, I'm certainly not drafting him. That didn't work out so well. And the reason that those guys get elevated, even Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas had good fantasy seasons last year with Peyton Manning essentially out of gas and Brock Osweiler being average at best. And Nuke Hopkins as well too. When he was the top end receiver, the correlation between all these players is volume. It's about targets. How many targets are you going to get? You know, if you're going to have bad quarterback play and get about 100 targets, you're not going to produce fantasy numbers because you're just not going to get the opportunities. But if you're going to have poor quarterback play and push 120, 150 targets, then you're going to be a relevant fantasy receiver just because of that volume. And especially when that gets married to an up-tempo approach, like what the Texans played with in the first half of the season, like what the Broncos played with under Peyton Manning, and the Jets as well run a high volume of plays and really just target the hell out of those two receivers. That's what fantasy scoring correlates with, not necessarily good quarterback play. So I think several guys come to mind. I think Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders are both being discounted in drafts because of Mark Sanchez. And, you know, even if Sanchez is not that good, those two are the only relevant players in that passing game. They're going to own probably 40% of the targets that get thrown this year just on their own. I mean, who else is there? Same thing. Same thing with the Jets. They don't have a third wide receiver or a receiving tight end. It's going to just funnel through those top two. And another guy that's a really good example of this is Torrey Smith in San Francisco. Everybody is scared off of Torrey Smith because he had 33 catches last year, and he played with poor quarterbacks, and he's going to play with poor quarterbacks again this year. But the pace and target share is all going up in San Francisco. Think whatever you want about Chip Kelly, and there's plenty of not so nice things you can think about him. But the one thing that is indisputable is that he pumps up the volume of his offensive players. They run a lot more plays. They run with more pace. That's going to just affect, there's going to just be a natural rising tide in the San Francisco offense that these skill position players are going to benefit from. And Smith is the only established player there. The only established player. San Francisco lost Anquan Bolden, who took 100 targets with him out the door. Vernon Davis is gone now, of course, too. Smith is going to probably just fall backwards into 120 targets, and that's going to make him a potential wide receiver too, no matter who's throwing him the ball.
Completely agree with all of that. Invest in those wide receivers when you can and whenever Matt recommends, ladies and gentlemen. And speaking of that, when would you recommend Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders as your second wide receivers this year, even because of that quarterback situation? And would you draft them as early as round 3, 4, or 5?
So I think that especially Thomas in a PPR league, I think he could be the type of guy that still catches a ton of passes because he'll just own a dominant share of the targets, and he's mostly effective on those bubble screens and quick slants, and I think that he'll just catch a lot of passes by volume there. I still think he'll have a top 15 season. He was the wide receiver 11 in PPR last year, again with really poor quarterback play. So there's really nothing has changed in Denver. They just have a different bad quarterback. They had bad quarterbacks last year. Now they just have a bad quarterback that everybody agrees is bad. So there's really nothing that's changed. I think you're kind of looking at Thomas is no longer a top 5 set it and forget it wide receiver 1 anymore. He's more of a mid to low end wide receiver 2, whereas Sanders is probably more of a high to mid 3. So you're just kind of knocking them down a peg, but you're not knocking them off the face of the earth. And I think that right now, both of their draft prices have that baked in there already.
Yes, sir. That would be a good place to draft that. And once again, he is Matt Harmon, ladies and gentlemen, creator of the reception perception method of evaluating wide receivers, also an exceptional fantasy staff writer for NFL.com and FootballGuys.com, and host of the Backyard Banter podcast. And we have one more question before we call it a night here. And are there any other wide receivers that people aren't talking about right now that could prove to be major finds in the later rounds of drafts?
Yeah, so I think Dante Moncrief, everybody's kind of on him, but I think he's the easiest breakout candidate to call this year. Marvin Jones isn't getting enough attention. He's going around the wide receiver 40 spot, typically in the late 8th to early 9th round. And that's like a 5-round difference to where Golden Tate goes sometimes in drafts. And that doesn't really make any sense because every report out of Detroit has said that those two will be kind of a 1A, 1B. They'll finish very close in targets. And even though Tate will have the more short area reliable targets, Jones will probably be the better red zone threat. He has the best contested catch conversion rate in reception perception history from his 2015 season. He's a guy that can play the ball in the air very well. And that's what they'll ask him to do. They'll ask him to run those boundary routes, and he'll be very good at that. And there's just not a lot of there. Again, a very concentrated offense between those two, because other than those two and Eric Ebron and Theo Riddick, there's not a lot of guys on the offense to throw the ball to. I really like the fit there in Detroit. He's a guy that's going under noticed. And, I mentioned that play volume in San Francisco being a big factor for Torrey Smith. It's gonna rise the boat up for somebody else as well too. And I think that my favorite there for a really deep sleeper is Bruce Ellington this year. He's a guy I really liked coming out of South Carolina. I took some notes on him for reception perception, some real brief stuff. But a guy that I really like to exceed his, essentially free ADP right now. He's not going to be a regular starter for you most likely, but because of the role he's going to play as the slot receiver there in San Francisco in Chip Kelly's offense, he could end up with 70 catches this year. I don't think that's out of the question.
Oh, fascinating stuff indeed. And one final tidbit. What players do you see making a quite a sizable decline this year, and should fantasy people have a buyer beware mentality of come draft time?
Easy one is Steve Smith, who still is going in the 9th round of drafts, which really doesn't make any sense to me. And I hate to say that because Steve Smith is my favorite NFL player ever. I love his game. I mean, my family's from Carolina. I grew up watching him. He's just a guy I really like. So he's a pretty obvious one. You shouldn't be drafting him. You should be drafting Kamar Aiken or Mike Wallace instead, to be honest with you, until we get anything concrete on Smith, which I don't think is going to happen. The other guy I would avoid is Larry Fitzgerald. I'm a big fan. I know this makes me sound like an ageist, and I don't mean to, but I really love. Everybody that follows my work knows I love John Brown. He's been one of my favorite receivers since he's come into the league. He's a reception perception superstar, and I think we're just seeing the beginning of his ascend. I like Michael Floyd in fantasy a lot this year too, in a contract year. I think he has a very high ceiling as well. And when we saw John Brown, Michael Floyd, Larry Fitzgerald, and David Johnson, and David Johnson is the key here, when we saw all four of those guys play together, Floyd's targets really got cannibalized by David Johnson because, as Evan Silvins has done a good job of pointing out, they run a lot of the same short slant drag routes across the middle of the field that Fitzgerald plays in that slot receiver role. His average depth of target weeks 13 to 17, when all of them were involved in the offense, cratered to 5.8. His yards per reception cratered to 8.6. He just came into a very low ceiling, high volume role, but the problem is the volume's not there. Get 150 targets in that role, you'd be fine with it, but that was just not the pace he maintained when everything was all together. And it's hard to emphasize small samples like that in the NFL, but I think when you look at the other factors of all these players being healthy, if all things are equal for the Cardinals, Fitzgerald's just not going to pay back his ADP. He's not going to do what he did last year, and I think this is the year Floyd and Brown begin to overtake him.
Completely agree about Larry Fitzgerald. And Matt Harmon, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for donating your time, knowledge, and impressive talents to the program tonight. But before I let you go, I want to share a personal note. Matt, you overcame a health problem several years ago, and that was documented by, of all things, CNN earlier this year. As I want to show you this screen share for our viewers, and I wanted to share it because I went through a health crisis myself 6 years ago with cancer, and oh, wow. I ate very poorly. I might not have been as overweight as you were in the picture. As you can see, the massive difference. Ladies and gentlemen, he turned his life around, and it's such an inspiration to all. And I gave up all the junk food after that. I'm almost a vegan right now. And there was that episode that drew me back to my love for football and the game of football and wanting to talk about it for a living. And just want to say you're an inspiration to all of us, Matt, and to me especially, given that I have gone through a similar route.
Well, first and foremost, congrats to you on your success. And cancer, that's something I couldn't even imagine going through myself. So much love and props to you, my friend. That is awesome. Thank God you are here with us today so we can do this. Do this thing together. I appreciate that. That is good. That is good news. And it's just, I'm very happy that my story was well received. It was something that I really felt passionate about sharing because I know that, it's an issue that a lot of people struggle with. It's something that I still struggle with: weight loss, depression, this, that, and the other. And I just hope that, and I don't want attention. I don't want back pats for it. I just want other people to know that there is a path out of it. And no matter what you think your circumstances are, it can get better. And it will get better if you take the steps and if you take control of your life, I guess, like I did. And I just hope that people see my story and know that too. So thank you for giving me the time to talk about it.
You're very welcome indeed. And thank you once again, Matt, for donating your amazing football mind to the program once again. And I definitely hope that this isn't the last time and we get to do this again sometime down the road very, very soon.
Absolutely. Anytime. Just let me know.
Indeed, Matt Harmon, ladies and gentlemen, founder, creator of The Reception Perception, host of the Backyard Banter Podcast, and staff writer for NFL.com and FootballGuys.com. And as this episode showed you, if you have a question about drafting wide receivers or any wide receivers in the National Football League and their fantasy football relevance, Matt Harmon is the guy to ask. You could go to him on Twitter at @MattHarmon_BYB. And that does it for tonight here on Sports Crunch with D. Crobb. But keep watching this page as well as my Blog Talk Radio page, because we have a lot of episodes in the next couple weeks coming up as NFL trading camps roll on. For Matt Harmon, I'm David Cromwell saying take care and stay awesome, people.